Power BI has a couple of different settings to control how numeric data gets aggregated when you're using it in visuals. There are also settings to control what happens when you have items in your visuals that don't have any numeric data associated with them, and also I also want to show you a little bit of how Power BI calculates totals for things like table visuals. Let's start with the summarization piece. You can see in the fields list on the right-hand side here, I've got some numeric columns indicated by the sigma symbol that show that they can be aggregated or summed up. So typically a revenue field, for example, if I drag that over, let's turn that into a table, I can see that we're summing all of the different rows of data underneath this. We're summing that value up to get our $22 million. If I select revenue over here and go to our modeling tab, you'll see we have this default summarization property that's currently set to sum. And that means that it's always going to sum that value up whenever I use it in a visual. If I was to drag the product field in as well, I see that value split out by product. So what we're saying under the covers here is go and find all of the rows in my data that correspond to this Aliki MA3 product and sum up the revenue column for those rows. Then go to the MA6 product and sum up the revenue values for that column. So we've got multiple rows in the underlying data set that's being aggregated to give us this value. Now I can choose different types of aggregations. So by default, sum is what we use for numeric columns, but I can change that and say by default you should average these numbers, minimum, maximum, or just count the numbers in this column. If, for example, you had an ID field that was numeric, you might actually want to say don't try and sum up those IDs, that doesn't make any sense. Just do a count of them or a distinct count for something like a user ID, that would be really common. I can also override it per visual. So if I come over to my fields well, I can see that revenue here is currently being done as a sum. I can change that in this visual and say, actually, I want to take the average revenue. So now what we're saying is go and find the rows that correspond to the Aliki MA3 product. And then for the revenue column, don't sum up the values in that column, take an average of them. And that's how you'll calculate this. It's important to understand the same thing applies with the totals row here. So we're not saying go and sum up all of the values that are in this table. We're saying for all products, what's the average revenue? So the average revenue across all of our different products is $567. So for each of our transaction lines, it's an average of $567. It's not an average of the averages either. So we're not saying take 329 and 255 and 241 and do an average of those. It's an average over all of the underlying rows. And that's a really important distinction to understand. The other thing that's important to understand is that for fields that are calculations, you can see these with a little calculator icon next to them. When you add one of these to your table, again, that calculation is going to be evaluated for each of the rows in this table, for each of the groups in this visual. So it'll say, OK, for each of the rows that correspond to the Aliki MA3 product, go and evaluate that sales year-to-date expression. And then again, at the total, we're saying, OK, across all of the rows of data, go and evaluate that sales year-to-date amount. Calculations, measures are always evaluated within the context of whatever data point it is I'm looking at in that visual. If I was to choose to group by something like our month name, let's go and grab my revenue figure again. You can see that for 2016 that I've got selected in this slicer, we've actually only got revenue for January through June. We didn't have any data for the rest of 2016. And so by default, Power BI will only show me rows where there are a corresponding revenue value for each month. I can override this as well. Back in my fields well, I can say, come to this month name, and actually I can ask to show items even if there's no data there. And what this means is it'll say, go and get me all of the distinct values from the month name column and show me the revenue figures. And if there's no revenue figures associated with it, just show a blank. That's a really useful way of being able to see all of the potential values within my data. But what's important to understand with this is that this is going to be combined as you have more and more groups of data. So if I had month name, and maybe I have my product category into here as well, and my product name, you'll start to see things like this, where I've got a little gap here. So for January, we didn't sell any mix Aliki MA06 products. Hence, there's a blank row here. So all of the different fields that we're grouping by, in this case, month name, category, and product, the combination of all of those will always show, even if there's no revenue associated with it. So that's the show items with no data option. The last thing I want to point out is the do not summarize or don't summarize this column value. I'm going to use our unit sales column here. So I can see in total we've sold 40,000 units. Now again, this is summing up that units value at the moment. Let's swap over to another matrix, a table rather, so it's easier to see. For a numeric field like this, if I choose to say don't summarize this, what this is actually going to do is show me all of the distinct values from that units column. So I can see there were some transactions where we sold 1 unit, there were some transactions where we sold 2 units, etc., etc. And our highest transaction, there was 1 or maybe more transactions where we sold 68 units in a single transaction. Now this doesn't mean that there are only 12 or so rows in our data. Choosing do not summarize will show me the unique values from that column. If I come back over to our data view, you can see all of the individual rows, and you can see down here I've got 2 rows where we sold 44 units, and as I scroll down, you can see we've had lots of transactions where we only had 6 or 4 or 3 units per transaction. So you don't see each of those distinct rows, you just see the particular values from that column. If I wanted to prove this out, I can drag my units column in again, and now let's do a count instead. And this is doing a count of the number of rows. So we had 38,000 transactions where we only sold 1 unit. We had 1 transaction where we sold 68 units, etc., etc. You see. So this is a really useful way of showing different combinations of data, whether we are or aren't showing it. A useful way of showing different aggregations of that data and setting the ones that you want to use by default. And also then showing the distinct values within that data to build different types of visuals at different levels of granularity.